Enterprise tech software vendors oftentimes suck at implementing their technology. Their methodologies are flawed, and I'm going to explain why that is here today. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting. We're an independent and tech agnostic consulting firm that helps clients throughout the world with their digital transformation journeys. And there is a statistic that's been remarkably steady over the last few decades in the enterprise technology space, and that is that upwards of 80% or more of ERP and digital transformation projects fail. And one of the common questions that we hear is, why is that? If we have all this history behind us and all these lessons learned, why haven't we gotten better at having a better success rate than what we've had in past years? And the reason for that is because the software vendor community has pursued the same general approach to implementing their technology year after year and decade after decade. Certain buzzwords and philosophies have come and gone, things like agile and waterfall and industry accelerators and rapid accelerators and things like that. There's been buzzwords that have suggested maybe things are getting better, but at the end of the day, you look at the failure rates and they're the same as they've always been. And I would argue in some cases, these failures are actually getting worse because technology is changing so much faster than organizations are able to change themselves. So with all that being said, you have to ask, why is that? What is the reason for failure? And generally speaking, it's not the technology itself. Even though the technology itself is advancing faster than organizations are capable of, the technology itself isn't necessarily flawed per se, but the way vendors implement the software is flawed, and it continues to be flawed year after year. So what I want to do today is talk about why vendor methodologies are flawed and what you can do to complete that picture and to augment the methodology flaws that they have. Be sure to stick around to the end of the video because I'll give you some tangible next step advice on what you can do to ensure that you're surrounding the vendor methodology with alternative methodology that will make your project more successful. Before we dive too far into today's content, I want to share a little bit of information about Third Stage Consulting and who we are. Third Stage Consulting Group is an independent technology agnostic provider of consulting services to help clients through their digital transformations. We help with digital strategy and software selection, as well as implementation planning. And during implementation, we provide services related to program management, organizational change, business process improvement, as well as enterprise architecture. These are just some of the services we provide. We have offices in North America as well as Europe and Asia Pacific. So if you'd like to learn more, I encourage you to check out our resource center, which includes a number of resources that will help you through your digital transformation, and you can access that for free using the QR code here or the links below. You can also reach out to me directly if you'd like to discuss your digital transformation and brainstorm ideas on how to improve where you're headed on your journey. Now let's jump back into today's content. The first and one of the biggest reasons why vendor methodologies are not up to par, not up to standard to make for successful projects is because they tend to have a myopic focus on technology. In other words, the methodologies that most vendors have is focused on designing, building, testing, training, and deploying software. All important stuff. I'm not suggesting that you need to skip those things, but what I will say is when you consume an overwhelming majority of your time and budget on those technical activities, you're missing the even more important activities that have nothing to do with designing, building, testing, training, and deploying technology. Instead, what organizations need to be focused more on and making sure that they have a solid methodology for is things around strategic alignment, making sure that your implementation strategy fits your overall business strategy. Most methodologies that vendors have is going to be a one-size-fits-all approach to designing and building technology, but you need to design and build technology and enable process improvements and organizational changes that support a broader strategy, which means you need a different methodology than what every other company might be using out there. Certainly there's similarities and tools that you can repeat and you don't need to recreate the wheel, but you do need to make sure your strategy and your approach is aligned with what it is you're trying to be when you grow up. Same with organizational change management. Vendors are pretty good at training people on how to use the basic off-the-shelf, out-of-the-box software, but they're not good, generally speaking, at showing them how to do their jobs in the new system using their nomenclature and their data, their customer examples, and specific to their industry. Generally speaking, vendors are focused on just teach them to learn the technology, teach them to create a PO, teach them to create a sales order, but it's not an end-to-end view, generally speaking, of how to perform their jobs day to day, and it certainly typically doesn't include definition around roles and responsibilities and how their jobs are changing, things of that nature. So that organizational change piece is oftentimes missing. So that myopic focus on technology misses out on these examples I gave you as well as many others. But the key here is you need to make sure you have a methodology that does more than just deploy technology. Another reason why software vendor methodologies oftentimes sucks is because they don't set realistic expectations. In fact, they do the opposite. They set unrealistic expectations. When you myopically focus on technology in the way that most software vendors do, understandably so, by the way, you focus on unrealistic assumptions because you're assuming that all there really is to do is to design, build, and deploy technology. But what takes the most time and what continues to stretch out implementation projects is not the technology typically, although it could extend the project or it could cause delays. It's usually the other stuff that causes delays. It's the organizational resistance. It's the lack of internal alignment, the lack of a solid plan or strategy going into the project. It's a lack of understanding the current processes versus the future processes. It's a lack of understanding how all these different systems and technologies are going to tie together. It's a lack of understanding how the data is going to get cleaned up and migrated to the new system. There's a lot of other things outside the control or outside the scope of software vendors that typically drive time, cost, and assumptions behind the actual reality of how the plan is executed. But yet the software vendors typically come to the table with a plan that doesn't contain those things or doesn't include those things. So when an organization or a team looks at that unrealistic plan, they set their budget on that, they set internal expectations on that plan, and they from the start are setting themselves up for failure because they never had a realistic shot of achieving that plan because it wasn't complete and it didn't have accurate assumptions. So ensuring that you have realistic expectations and that your plan reflects reality and it reflects the complete view of your transformation is one of the most important things you can do before you get too far into your implementation. There's been research over the years that shows that one of the biggest reasons, if not the biggest reason, why projects get delayed and go over budget is because of something called decision latency or a lack of decision-making speed. In other words, organizations can't make decisions fast enough to keep the project on track, yet the vendor needs an answer right away to stay on track with their project plan. And sometimes it's understandable why a client would slow down or why they take their time on certain decisions because they need to make sure they get everyone aligned and on the same page and make sure they're all rowing in the same direction. Now, one way to avoid this is to make sure you make as many of those decisions as you can before the actual time starts ticking on the actual implementation itself. So in other words, that phase zero, that implementation planning phase where you spend time getting aligned and getting some of these decisions out on the table, getting the messiness of alignment and decision-making out on the table, do that before the meter really starts running at a high rate on all the expensive technical consultants that are coming in to support the project. Now, the problem here is that you have economic self-interest that leads software vendors and their implementation partners to push you to get started right away because the sooner you start with their resources, the sooner they can accelerate their revenue. But that's a bad thing for you because that's generally speaking going to slow you down later because you haven't taken the time to make decisions up front, but you're going to have to make the decisions later while things are getting more expensive by the day, by the week, and by the month. So perhaps the biggest way around this is to have a phase zero where you make those decisions before you bring on the army of technical consultants to start deploying technology. In my opinion, one of the biggest flaws in the enterprise technology services space is a lack of willingness to understand the current state of client situations. Every client has strengths and weaknesses. They have warts. They have things they could be doing better. We all know that. I'm not disputing that. But what software vendors are notorious at doing is coming in and saying, we don't care about your current state processes. What we care about is how our technology works and how you're going to conform to fit our software. We want you to be fit to standard. We want you to minimize customization. We want to have a clean core in this implementation. We want to use our quote unquote best practices. By the way, best practices don't exist. That's a whole nother conversation for another time, but they'll use that as a way to suggest that your current state doesn't matter. What matters is the technology you're deploying. Now, there is some truth to this. That's not entirely false, but it's completely underestimating the importance of the current state. And you don't want to go so far down the path of focusing on current state that you create a situation where you're unwilling to change and your team's unwilling to change, or where you start to overanalyze your current state. But you do need to understand how you got to where you are. Why are you doing things the way you are? Because in some cases, you're going to find that yes, you're wasting time. Yes, you're wasting money. Yes, you could do things better. Yes, you're willing to conform to however the technology works. But there are going to be parts of your business where you say, hold on a minute, we're not willing to conform blindly to software or functionality that doesn't make sense for our business. If it's something that provides a unique competitive advantage, and it truly does provide a competitive advantage, software vendors have a way of dismissing that and saying, well, that's not best practice. Our software is best practice. Your way of doing things is old, outdated. It's a legacy mindset. There's technical debt, blah, 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 et cetera, et cetera. So what's important to understand is that people in an organization understand the way things are today. They don't yet understand the future state. We need to get them there to understand that, but we have to start with where they are today and meet them there. And if anything, just to help empathize and understand where they're coming from, which, by the way, will help from a change management perspective, because now you're listening and you're understanding versus just dismissing it and saying the technology is what matters, not your current way of doing things. But it also gives you a clear map of how you're going to help people on their journey from current state to future state. If you don't understand the current state, that creates a ton of problems that trickle down throughout the entire project. And that is, generally speaking, as a broad stereotype, something that software vendors generally are not good at in their methodologies. Now, I've shared with you some of the reasons why I think software vendor methodologies generally suck. But what do we do about it? Do we just accept the fact that they suck and that we're destined to have an 80% or more probability of failure? Not at all. That's not at all what I'm suggesting. And I'm also not suggesting that you throw out the software vendors' methodologies. But what I am saying is that you reframe the methodology and augment the software vendor methodologies, because their methodology addresses one work stream of many within your overall transformation. If all you do is follow their methodology, you're only following the methodology for technology. You're not defining a methodology that addresses the even more important aspects of operations, the organization, the strategy, the alignment, integration between systems, all that other stuff. That stuff is what is more likely to make your project succeed or fail, yet software vendors generally don't address that in their implementation methodology. So that's perhaps the biggest thing you can do, is ensure that you have a complete tech-agnostic business transformation-focused methodology, not just a technology methodology. Secondly, is to make sure you have a phase zero. Make sure you take that time up front before all the software consultants start showing up on site. Make sure you take the time to work through your alignment issues, which you probably have. Every organization does. You probably have lack of clarity around what you want your future state to be. That's okay. Get that messiness out on the table and work through it. You can hire a company like ours at Third Stage Consulting to help you with that. It's something we do all the time. Once you have that clear roadmap for what it is you want to be when you grow up, then you can start to bring on the technical consultants, and you're going to make much better use of their time, and you're not going to spend nearly as much money on the implementation by doing that. So those are two examples of what you can do to ensure that you avoid some of these issues with vendor methodologies being subpar. But I'd love to hear from you. What have you seen work with vendor methodologies, and what have you had to add to the methodologies to make it work for you? Love to hear your feedback in the comments below. And if you'd like to learn more about lessons from 1,000 different digital transformations and what it takes to make a digital transformation successful in general, please be sure to download our guide to 1,000 digital transformations. You can find that by scanning the QR code right here, or you can go to the links below. So I hope you found this information useful, and hope you have a great day. So these are just two tips I'd share with you on how to, what did I say? I don't even remember. I sometimes say things, I don't know what came out of my mouth. Like, I have no idea what I just said.